It's easy to be nice when everybody's nice to you, you know. You just naturally reciprocate. So there's no credit there to me or any, well, more to the Torrance Center than to me. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have been able to recognize all these people? All but one? Who's the one that no one knows? Just out of curiosity.
Lower left.
Lower. Yeah. That's Ang Lee.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Everybody got her too? Okay. 'Cause, yeah, he's. I wanted to throw in. I'm trying to get all the different ways of creativity and here. That, over here. Yeah, that's kind of a sad one. Can I move on? She's dying of leukemia at the time that picture was taken.
And who is she?
And I'm giving you hints. Okay, she won 2 Nobel Prizes. Marie Curie. Okay, and it's because she won 2 Nobel Prizes that she looks like that. Because she discovered first radium, then polonium, and realized that they had tremendous medicinal properties, and became a pioneer in using radioactivity in medicine, only to find out that there were negative things associated with high exposure to radioactivity. Okay. Anyway, I deliberately picked a very, very diverse group to show, or to say, to claim, and I'm going to illustrate this during this talk, that they all have something very important in common. Something that they have in common that allowed them all to be put up on this one slide together. Okay? So that's what I'm talking about. And what they have in common is what I call diversifying experiences. Okay, this is a catch-all term for a lot of different developmental events that occur not in childhood, not just in childhood and adolescence, but also in adulthood, that increase creativity. I'm going to look at this phenomenon using 3 totally different methodologies. I'm going to look at first the histometric research. Most of my research is histometric. Histometric means that you study actual geniuses. And then you quantify historical and biographical data, you do content analyses, and then you make predictions. You actually end up with statistical or mathematical models at the end. It's kind of crazy. You get a biography, goes in one end, and out comes an equation at the other. You know? And then I'll look at some research using techniques that most of you are most familiar with, psychometric, using regular instruments to measure various kinds of characteristics. And finally, some experimental findings, including some very recent ones. I'll maybe even have time to mention one that is not on a slide, but supports the same basic thesis that I'm arguing. Okay, so let me introduce the problem, sort of give you general background, be very new, very unnew at first. First, I'm going to talk about what I mean by creativity. And this is something important because a lot of people have somewhat complacently accepted what Mark Ronco calls the standard definition. Most of the people in this room believe in the standard definition. I think the standard definition is insufficient. The standard definition is some variation of novelty and usefulness or value, appropriateness or whatever. 2 criteria. I think you need 3. And in support of 3, I cite the criteria that the US Patent Office uses to decide whether or not you get a patent. They have 3, they don't have 2. Okay? So what are the 3 criteria that I use? One is originality. Now you say that's basically novelty, but it's not. It's just low statistical probability. Okay? Novelty, I think, is conflating 2 different criteria that are actually separate from each other. They can be together, but a lot of times, in important times, they're different. And then we have utility. It's going to be value, appropriateness, usefulness, whatever your favorite word is. And of course, it depends partly on the area of creativity. If we're talking about the science, this might be truth. If we're talking about the arts, this might be beauty. Okay? But whatever area that we're interested in, we're going to have some kind of utility function or utility criteria we use. Like whether it's going to get published, whether it's going to get shown, whether it's going to get performed or recorded, that kind of thing. And then the final one is surprise. The way the Patent Office phrases this is it has to be non-obvious. And by non-obvious, I mean it can't be something that just comes from standard expertise. If you're an expert in the field, you can generate a lot of original and useful ideas, but so can everybody else who has the same expertise that you do. It can be algorithmic, in other words. So to be surprising means you have to produce something that is not an obvious connection with previous knowledge or previous expertise. Really stands out. Anybody will say, whoa, that is really surprising. Where did you get that idea? And I argue that surprise and originality is what a lot of people conflate into novelty. And they really should be separated. Okay? And this is a very important criterion because being able to come up with an idea that's surprising is not surprisingly pretty difficult to do. Okay? It's what we mean when we talk about think outside the box. Okay. And then I'm going to talk about two different assessments of creativity. On the one hand, we can talk about personal or little c creativity. This is everyday creativity. And this is a very important kind of creativity because this is the creativity we have in everyday life. You know, solving problems and hopefully coming up with creative solutions to those problems. But another kind of creativity is consensual creativity or big C creativity, where your creativity becomes part of a larger group of people who accept that creativity. They like your music, they use your theory, they buy your books, and so it's part of consensus. It becomes consensual, and a lot of times this consensus is by experts in the field. Usually, you need experts to first say, yes, this should be published or recorded or whatever. But then later on, of course, it gets a larger consensus. There's the general public that likes your novels or likes your music or whatever. Beyond that, expert domain, the gatekeepers, as it were. And this distinction is very, very important because sometimes the characteristics that predict little c creativity are the same as big C creativity, and sometimes they're very different. Okay? One thing I'm not going to talk about much here is like psychopathology, but I have a paper that just came out this year in Perspectives in Psychological Science where I show that one of the things that just sets little c and big C creativity has to do with the role of psychopathology in creativity. Anyway, okay, now I said the key to all this is diversifying experiences, but I haven't defined the term yet. Okay, and like I said, it's a very broad catch-all term. It includes a lot of different things. Right? So this is the rough definition. Events or circumstances that disrupt conventional and or fixed patterns of thinking, thus enabling a person to view the world in multiple ways, to exhibit cognitive flexibility. That's one of the major manifestations. Like in divergent thinking, one of the things you can score on, of course, is cognitive flexibility. How many different categories are represented in the responses to a given stimulus, right? And a lot of research suggests that often cognitive flexibility is more important than fluency or originality per se in solving problems. I mean, the classic example of that is in the two strings problem. How many are familiar with the insight problem? Two strings, you got to tie them together. And the key is being able to recognize that you can use a pair of pliers as a pendulum. That requires cognitive flexibility, using it in a way that you don't normally use it. By the way, this definition, I'm not particularly fond of it. It's kind of awkward, and I can kind of have an excuse for it being awkward because it was actually a graduate student of mine who came up with it, and I'm going to use it for a while until she has her first real job. Right now she's in a postdoc, but so I'm going to quote her. And by the way, it's interesting because she illustrates this concept of a diversified experience. She was born in Romania and then went to school in Germany and then got her higher degree in the United States. And her first job offer was in Denmark. This is very, very, but she turned it down. Sorry about that. It's University of Copenhagen, but there was good reasons why she turned it down. Anyway, These have both short and long-term effects. Some of the things I'll be talking about are long-term effects of diversifying experiences, and other things I'll be talking about are very short-term, like the laboratory stuff, where we can actually manipulate creativity by exposing people to some very interesting diversifying experiences in the laboratory. Of course, it may not last long, but it has a very strong impact at the time. Okay. I have some propositions I'm going to be arguing. They're basically like themes. They're permeating the entire talk. First of all, diversifying experiences increase creativity. Okay? And part of that is through the impact on cognitive flexibility. Okay? This positive effect is stronger for artistic than for scientific creativity. I'll give some examples of that. But it's also important for scientific creativity. In a sense, scientific creativity comes sort of like halfway in between artistic creativity and non-creativity. It's got more constraints on it. Constraints of logic, constraints of fact that does artists have. Well, we even have that term, artistic license, where you just ignore reality, and it's okay, you know? Even Shakespeare did that. I've done a lot of research on Shakespeare, and there's some plays where he just takes liberties with human nature, you know, for dramatic effect. Okay, and then this distinction between big C and little c comes back because the effect of diversifying experiences is stronger for big C creativity than it is for little c creativity, but it's important for both. Okay, so now comes the literature review. It's going to look at correlation research. In fact, most of what we're going to be looking at tonight is correlation research. Just looking at the relationship between variables without any manipulation, independent variable. But I will talk about experimental research at the end that kind of backs up the correlation research. Okay? In the correlational area, I'm going to look at two different methods. As I mentioned before, the hysterometric. I'll look at that first, and then I'll look at the psychometric. Okay, the hysterometric research. Again, this is applying mathematical, statistical methods, quantification, analysis to actual data about real geniuses. Okay. Look at some influential factors. I'll first look at the aggregate level. Look at what's happening at the level of nations, cultures, civilizations. My first research was on that area. My doctoral dissertation looked at the ups and downs in creativity in Western civilization. It was the most ambitious thing you could possibly imagine. Over 5,000 creators were in the sample. Okay. I've done another study of Chinese civilization. Chinese civilization's been around a lot longer than Western civilization, so I had 10,000 in that sample. But they were all aggregated into generations, so there were actually a lot fewer. And then I'll turn to the individual level, which you're more familiar with, individual creators, and why do they differ in their creativity. Okay, at the aggregate level, there's a lot of factors here. You probably think by now everything's going to come in twos. Now things aren't going to come in twos anymore. Okay? Okay? Political fragmentation. If you look at civilizations, there's some periods in which there's a big, huge imperial state that covers most of the civilization. Like in history of Islamic civilization, there were periods in which there's big empires, like the Ottoman Empire, for example. We have some people from Istanbul here. That was the capital towards the end of the Ottoman Empire. And there were other periods in Islamic civilization which was fragmented. A lot of different principalities and states. Even like one little area like Spain had all these different principalities in it. Okay? We think of like the Italian Renaissance. What was Italy like during the Italian Renaissance? All these little tiny states. Not just the Roman Empire had fallen, but the Holy Roman Empire had lost its influence in the Italian peninsula. Okay? So guess what? Political fragmentation is correlated with golden ages. I mean, there are exceptions, of course. It's some interesting exceptions, like in Chinese history. And I don't have time to talk about why there's these exceptions, but Chinese history, when there was this great unification, like under the Tang Dynasty, there was a major golden age in particularly Chinese poetry. Okay? But what happens in political fragmentation is you end up having more opportunities for diversified experiences. You have more languages that emerge. That's what happened with the fall of Rome. All of a sudden, instead of everybody speaking Latin, You got people speaking Portuguese and Spanish and German and, well, just the Romance languages alone, you have about 5 major Romance languages that came out of the Latin Vulgate. Okay? So all of a sudden you could have new literatures. You no longer had to write poetry, bad poetry in Latin. You could write good poetry in French. Imperial stability is related to this. So what happens if you have an imperial state? Okay? Then rebel against it. Okay? So nationalistic revolts against imperial states have a positive impact on creativity. By the way, a lot of these effects don't happen right away. They happen often after a generation delay when people grow up under the new circumstances. Okay? But it kind of gets a booster shot in terms of cultural diversity, which is one of the things we'll look at in a second. Civil disturbances, very closely related to that as well. When you have, within a society, different peoples vying with each other, competing with each other, about what is the nature of the fundamental values, like in the United States, slavery versus anti-slavery. Okay? That's an example of a civil disturbance. Ideological diversity, this is an interesting one. This is when you have different ideologies competing with each other, different philosophies of life competing with each other, vying for the attention and the commitment of various individuals in society. Mao Zedong has an interesting thing. How's it? Let 100 flowers blossom and 100, oh, it's 1,000 flowers. I wish I could get that quote right. But the basic idea is he argued that there should be lots of controversy, a lot of debate. And so he launched this movement that was supposed to kind of make China more creative, and it ended up backfiring. Because they found out it lost control. Just like, China's losing control of Hong Kong. You can only have so much diversity in an authoritarian state. Okay, cultural heterogeneity. This is where you have a lot of different cultures represented. And they're not necessarily co-equal, but they're all recognized as legitimate cultures in one way or another, legitimate contributions to society. I did this very interesting study of this, looking at Japanese civilization. You say, why Japanese civilization? Japanese civilization is a very interesting civilization because there are periods in its history where it totally isolated itself from the rest of the world, had very little contact. And there are other periods in the history of Japan where it just opened the floodgates to all sorts of influences. So, for example, one of the earlier periods when this happened is when all of a sudden they opened themselves up to Buddhist missionaries from China and also Korea. And they got this major influx, not just of Buddhist thought, but Buddhist art, and literature. And that had a major impact on Japanese civilization. But later on, this closed the gates again. And in fact, the last time they had to open the gates, they didn't want to. You may know the story. It was actually the United States that showed up with a ship and Admiral Perry and said, we want you to open the gates. And they said no. And they said, okay, then we're going to use our cannons to blow your gates down. And that's how they opened up. Okay? But it was to their advantage because then they got this major influx and there was a major new creative period at the beginning of the 20th century in Japan. So what I focused on Japan to look at the ups and downs in Japanese creativity. Remember, this is at the aggregate level. As a function of various kinds of inputs of cultural heterogeneity. I looked at, for example, any evidence of outside influences. Did this Japanese artist find their work inspired by a Chinese artist or a Korean artist, for example? Or this artisan working with pottery uses a model, something that they found from Korea. Okay? I looked at whether or not they traveled abroad. And we're going to get back to that later at the individual level. But a lot of times you'd have these Japanese that would go to China or go to Korea and go, whoa, look what they're doing here. We had no idea. And then finally, of course, you can have immigrants, like the Buddhist missionaries I mentioned earlier, that come in and bring new ideas, cultural traits, as it were. And all three of these things, both collectively and independently, increase the amount of creativity in Japanese civilization. And then on the other hand, when Japan closed the door, slammed the door in some cases, really slammed, If you were a Jesuit missionary and you disobeyed their law that Jesuit missionaries are not allowed in Japan, you got killed. You got executed. Okay? There was no tolerance, zero tolerance whatsoever. They didn't even put you on a boat, slow boat to China. Well, that's not far to go. Okay. At the individual level, okay, we'll see sort of echoes of what we saw at the aggregate level. Familial unpredictability. I'm trying to find a better term for this, but I'll have to do it for now. But you live in a family, you grew up in a family where things were kind of unconventional and different and didn't go the way everything goes in those nice TV families that you saw when you were a little kid. At least, well, those of you that are my age saw when you're a little kid, father knows best and that kind of stuff, where everything was conventional, all the kids were adorable, and maybe they were a little rascally, but otherwise everything was fine. These people have very, very unconventional backgrounds and chaotic backgrounds. So you see this in parental diversity. The parents are much more likely to come from different backgrounds, different ethnic groups, different parts of the country, have different religions. So it's very different than having parents that, they were childhood sweethearts from junior high school and went to the same church, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So this is very important, particularly in artistic creativity, less so for scientific creativity. Having very opinionated parents. They always have an opinion about everything. So every single dinner, they're always yapping about something, this, that, or the other thing. And you're just exposed to, as a little kid, you're going, whoa, there's all these people who have different beliefs. And, it's like that ideological diversity that I talked about at the aggregate level. Okay? Economics ups and downs. So sometimes the family is doing well, sometimes not, has to move. Freud had some really interesting experience of that when he was, a little kid, because his dad was a wool merchant. I mean, he was a rabbi too, but you couldn't earn money as a rabbi, so he was his day job was being a wool merchant. And sometimes he did very well, and sometimes they didn't do very well. So it's tremendous economic ups and downs. Another thing. Related to that, geographical mobility. You're much less likely to have grown up in one single place, but your family moved around. Again, they use Freud as an example because of not just the economic ups and downs, but also because of anti-Semitism. They often found themselves moving until they finally ended up in Vienna. They started off in Moravia and ended up in Vienna, in the capital of this Austro-Hungarian Empire. And early traumatic experiences. Most of the research is focused on orphanhood, the loss of one or both parents in early childhood or adolescence. Here's an example of one study. They looked at eminent people. There were about 700 eminent people in the sample. These are all people famous enough to get into a major encyclopedia. Not the Wikipedia. The Encyclopedia Britannica, which doesn't even exist anymore, except by...
Young people don't know encyclopedia.
Yeah, what's an encyclopedia? I mean, this is the sad thing, is the only encyclopedia that really exists these days is the Wikipedia. And that's okay, because some of the entries in the Wikipedia are really, really good. They're written by experts in the field, and others aren't. In fact, others are really, really bad. And their editing policy, that wiki policy, is absurd. If you look at any entry of somebody who's well-known but controversial, you'll see that the people who are doing these edits are trying to sneak by the sabotage rule or whatever, And so what they do is they take a sentence and then they add another sentence, but they can't replace the earlier sentence, so they just add another sentence that says the exact opposite. And then you have to figure out which of the two is true. Okay? It's usually the second one. It's a positional effect. Okay. Anyway, in this case, almost half of the people in the sample lost at least one parent before they were 21 years of age. That's huge. And by the way, this study didn't happen to have a good control group, but some of these studies have really good control groups. Like there was one study looked at British prime ministers and showed that a huge percentage of them lost one or both parents when they were young. And they used several control groups, like members of the House of Parliament who were the same cohort, as well as members of the House of Lords. So in comparison to those groups, they have higher orphanhood rates, higher rates of parental loss. By the way, some of this information I give you, you should not apply it. I say that because there was actually a case in California where two brothers killed their parents. The Menendez brothers. Yeah, they're still in prison for it. And when one of the brothers was asked, why did you kill your parents? It's because I wanted to be a great leader, and research shows that great leaders don't have parents. And he actually named some people like Alexander the Great, and don't do it. Okay. Physical or cognitive ability, it's actually sometimes an asset. Even though you might not think so if you're the one who has to suffer it, of having some kind of disability, either a cognitive or physical disability. And it may not necessarily be real. It just needs to be something that you think is real, that stigmatizes you. You might have a speech impediment of some form.
Or like being creative.
Huh?
Or like being creative.
Or like being creative could be another stigma too. In a group that's not creative, And I happen to have a speech impediment, so I'm aware of this. And it was interesting because I had this one student come up to me. This is how I found. I've never been diagnosed. I got this from a student. Okay. You don't hear a speech impediment?
No.
You don't hear me slurring my words?
No.
I'm totally articulate.
Yes.
It's working. Okay. Because I decided to try to overcome it, so I took drama to try to learn how to, overcome this kind of thing. But so that's not coming out. Okay, that's why you only got me one glass of wine. Okay, but anyway, it's another diversifying experience.
When you slur after several letters.
Anyway, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's amazing how many people have something that they feel stigmatizes them. Sets them apart. Okay. Another example of psychopathology, there's a huge debate on the mad genius issue, okay? And a lot of it centers on things like, do you have to be mad, and what kind of contribution does... It's not really madness per se, because when you think about it, outright madness means you're not going to be creative. You've all seen that movie Beautiful Mind, I'm sure, and when he was having his paranoid, psychoses, he was not creative. He was doing crazily creative things in a way, but at the same time, it was not creative. It wasn't adaptive. It was surprising, and it was original, but it had no utility. Okay, and so obviously, it's not the extreme that we're talking about. We're just talking about, you have moments of depression, and somehow your friends can't relate, or you have a mind that kind of goes off kilter, and you're easily distracted, and you change your what you're talking about during the course of one sentence. I'm not naming names.
I told Bonnie early on that she was a cognitive alien because I had read something that described it so perfectly.
Cognitive aliens.
Well, at least you're cognitive.
Yeah.
The glass is not full here. We're working.
So the important point, it can be both cognitive and affective, but it sets you apart from other people. And I've done some research on this, and others have done that the symptoms start appearing relatively early, usually around adolescence, where you start thinking, I'm different. There's some things I can't share with my parents, or I can't even share with my best friend, or I'm afraid to share with my significant other. And so I've done some research on this, and this study just came out earlier this year. This is not related to the other study I mentioned, which was an analytical study. This is an empirical study. It looked at 204 highly eminent creators. They were scientists, like Charles Darwin was in the sample, artists, composers. William Schumann was in the sample. Yeah, a lot of you know he died in a mental institution. And writers like, oh God, there's so many, Dickens and Dickinson, both D's. And then thinkers like Nietzsche, for example, they're on this sample. And it got some really interesting results. For the artists and the writer, it's strictly a linear relationship. Now, I have to point out, this doesn't mean these people went crazy. They just have higher levels of symptoms. These people have no symptoms at all, and this is just a DSM definition. So they're basically subclinical for the most part, although, as I just said, some of them did flip over on the other side and didn't come back, like Schumann and Nietzsche. So for them, it's strictly linear. For the others, it's curvilinear. In the case of the composers, these are primarily classical composers. The peak is somewhere in the middle here, okay? And then it declines, but doesn't decline as far as being lower than at the beginning with no symptomatology at all. And then for the thinkers, the peak is a little bit later, towards the end. Okay, very interesting. And then for the scientists, this is really cool, because I consider myself a scientist. And I might be crazy enough to do this talk, but I'm not that crazy. Their peak is much earlier, and the extreme levels of psychopathology are lower than no psychopathology at all. So there's overall a negative effect. And there's some other research showing that all the various forms of creativity, remember I said there's a difference between artistic and scientific creativity. Science tends to be the more normal mental process. Immigration and minority status, there's a huge amount of evidence that being a first or second generation immigrant is good for your creativity, okay? Disproportionate. Now, of course, when we talk about this, we're talking about in the absence of oppression, right? Being an African American for most of our history didn't do you much good. And I'm going to give you an example towards the very end, having minority status. And another example of that is interesting. You know, Jews have gone down in history as disproportionately represented amongst the Nobel Prize winners, way beyond expectation. And in general, even prior to the advent of the Nobel Prize, at the beginning of the 20th century, Jews are overrepresented among scientists, philosophers, thinkers in general. Okay, and yet you have to look very carefully at the data. That's only true in those parts of Europe where the Jews were not subject to major discrimination, where they were so-called emancipated. It's interesting that the emancipation of Jews in the Austro-Hungarian Empire occurred just shortly after Freud was born. If they had continued the discriminatory laws, I wouldn't have Freud as an example in this lecture, probably. Okay? So you have to have some degree of freedom from discrimination. You can't be a scientist if you can't get a job being a scientist. In fact, I've done three studies actually on eminent African Americans, and what's interesting is a lot of the African Americans became famous scientists. In order to do so, they had to go to Europe. Okay. Study abroad is the other side to this, right? And we saw this in the aggregate data for Japan. You study abroad. The members of the National Academy of Sciences are disproportionately people who studied abroad. They either studied abroad or they immigrated here. You know, so they're getting exposed to different ways of thinking, often different languages. They're maybe taking their courses in different languages than they grew up in. Multiple role models and mentors are extremely important, particularly for our artists. I did this one study of eminent artists in the Western world, and those who were the most eminent were influenced by the most mentors and most teachers. They were disciples of a lot of different people, influenced by a lot. You look at Picasso, and he's got lots of influences on it. Michelangelo, lots of influences. The ones who are less creative maybe have one mentor, and they just become a spitting image of that mentor, a clone, you know, continuing the tradition. Okay, omnivorous reading. Of course, I guess now you would have to substitute wide web surfing. where you click on all the hyperlinks spontaneously. And so you end up looking up this and you end up in a totally different world. But that's okay, it's still omnivorous, right? You're still exposing you to a lot of different things, including ideas you wouldn't even think of, would never dream of. That's actually one of my failings, is that I love the internet. I like to read too. I have a Kindle with over 1,000 works on it. But I can't help but look something up and then I see a link to something. You know, I have the New York Times I get every morning, and they have these links, and you click on them, and then you're on something else, and something else, and pretty soon you're not even the New York Times anymore. Okay, and then professional marginality. This is where you were trained in one thing, but ended up in something totally different. So you end up looking at your new profession in a totally different way. One of my favorite examples is Pasteur. You've all heard of pasteurization and vaccination and all these kinds of stuff that he invented. But what a lot of people don't know is that he started off as a chemist. He had no training in biology, no training in microbiology, no training at all. He started as a chemist, studying crystals. He was able to show that this one particular crystal, I think it was tartrate something, this one particular crystal came in a right-hand form and a left-hand form, which we now know there's a lot of crystals that do that. Okay, his teacher, Dumas, not the author's Dumas, but a chemist Dumas, told him that there was this disaster happening in the French silkworm industry, that there was some disease that was destroying all the silkworms, and this was a major industry in southern France, and it was, it would cost millions and millions of dollars. And so he asked his star pupil, this is after he became famous as a chemist, "You got to work on this, Louis." And Louis told his mentor, he says, "But I don't know anything about silkworms." And Dumas says, "So much the better." And what was interesting is he went in there, immediately identified the problem. It was a microbe that was, infecting the silkworms, told the growers they had to destroy all the silkworms that showed any symptoms of the disease and start from scratch, and save the industry, when all the industry experts were saying, what he's telling you won't work, don't listen to him. Okay? So that's another example of a diversifying experience. I just want to raise some important precautions, okay? Because I've listed a lot of things here, okay? And you have to be careful because there's going to be a lot of exceptions and so forth. These will carry over when we look at the individual psychometric stuff. There are multiple determinants. I just listed a lot of them. Okay? There's a huge number. Some of them are going to have positive effects. They're going to be accentuating creativity, creative development. And others are going to have dampening effects. And sometimes it will be the same thing that can have either a positive effect or a negative effect, because you have to find just the right level. Okay? So I describe this as nonlinear functions. We're always talking about linear. I already showed you an example with psychopathology. Out of 5 disciplines, 3 of them, the majority, had curvilinear relationships. Okay? So what you have to do is find the optimal level, the just right, or what my graduate student calls the sweet spot. On a tennis racket, sweet spot. And it's hard to know what that is because here's effect here, here's effect there, and you're summing all these effects together, and you hope you get it just right. But it may not be just right. It may be not enough or too. In other words, it's a Goldilocks story. Not too much and not too little, but just right. Okay? And this optimum, what makes it difficult to do this optimum, is going to depend on the domain, like whether it's science or art. You're going to need less. The sweet spot optimum is going to be lower in the total diversifying experiences than in the arts. Okay. In fact, it could be that you have someone who's heading towards science, and they have so many diversifying experiences, they end up being an artist instead. Okay. And it's going to depend on the person, because each person has its own. Well, the term we often use is resilience. We vary in the degree of resilience or accommodation power. Okay? Some people have a lot, some people have a little, so some people will be overwhelmed by what will be stimulating to someone else. Okay? And this is a great quote. It's from Samuel Butler's Way of All Flesh. And by the way, I like this quote so much that I finally decided to read the book. And that was very unfortunate because this quote is actually the best part of the book. This is as good as it gets. Okay. In quiet, uneventful lives, which means low, diversifying experiences, right? The changes, internal and external, are so small that there are little or no strain in the process of fusion and accommodation. In other lives, there is great strain. So there's lots of diversifying experiences. But there's also great fusing and accommodating power. In others, great strain with little accommodation power. It went too far. Okay? A life will be successful or not according to as the power of accommodation is equal to or unequal to the strain of the fusing and adjusting internal and external changes. That's actually kind of amazing thing. That's a very complex statement from a novelist, you know? But it could almost be a scientific statement and talking about how you have this juggling effect. Okay. Like you've all, you know, what's on my thing here, right? What do you tell this guy? You know, this guy's obviously getting a lot of strain here, a little too much, you know, diversifying experiences. You know, you have to tell him, you know, just hang in there, try to lessen the load, accommodate. What doesn't kill you will make you stronger. That's not very good advice. I don't know if that worked for him. Actually, you know, he survived pretty well because he did how many paintings of this? And etchings and versions of this? Yeah, he had a psychological problem. He was using this. This is his state. But he didn't commit suicide. He just did lots of these. Okay, now let's go to the psychometric research. I want to start with cognitive inhibition, because cognitive inhibition is closely connected with psychopathology. There's a high correlation between not being able to inhibit either external stimuli that you shouldn't be paying attention to or internal thoughts that you shouldn't be paying attention to. You have a failure of your filtering system. Okay. And so, in fact, someone on a list, it was Division 10 listserv in APA, posted the preliminary results she had. It was very interesting, where she looked at using brain imaging, okay, looking at the ability to filter out extraneous stimuli. Usually it's using the reduced latent inhibition task. That's the scientific term for it. And finding out that there was no difference between the psychotics, actually the schizophrenics, and the highly creatives in her sample. No difference, okay? Now, why was one group a psychotic and one not? Well, there's other moderating variables, like high general intelligence and high ego strength, for example, okay? And you also see high elusive thinking. Elusive thinking is what I mentioned before. You go from one thing to another, and it's kind of hard to make the connection. I tend to be an elusive thinker. That's why I love PowerPoint, because it always keeps me online, on track. And my wife complains all the time about my elusive thinking, because we'll be talking, and somehow the conversation will change. And she'll say, how did we get to be talking about that? And I said, well, we start off talking about this. She says, I still don't see the connection. So she forces me to try to establish the links. And of course, I can do it, but the links are like the last thing you would possibly think of. The remotest association possible, but still possible. Okay, so that's associated with creativity. There's a lot of research showing this. Shelley Carson, let me back up. Shelley Carson at Harvard has done some really interesting stuff. She has a scale sheet in her college devised, the creative achievement scale. That starts off with no creativity at all. I mean, it really starts at the baseline, and then goes up to famous creativity, getting awards, that kind of stuff. Okay, so and that is associated with reduced latent inhibition. Okay, it's really cool. but only for high IQ people, not for low IQ people. There's no relationship. Okay, now I'll get to bilingualism and multilingualism. There's a lot of research on that. I published a paper on this, reviewing all the literature back in 2008. I was asked to do it for the next edition, and I said, I can't do it anymore. It's gotten so complicated. I just can't handle it anymore, and gave them somebody else who was more up on the latest research. But the basic idea is that if you are fully functional in two languages, because that's the important provision, if you're fully functional in two languages, so you can go back and forth between the two and say the same things and have the same conversation, then think about it. You have to code everything in different ways. As you know, when you know another language, there's no such thing as exact synonyms. You know, there's no, every word is translated differently. And sometimes there'll be multiple definitions, multiple meanings on one side and few on the other, or sometimes it switches. And it's often arbitrary, and you can't, well, it's not really arbitrary, it's just the two languages have different histories, you know, different sources. And so it increases cognitive flexibility. But if you actually have the languages totally different, you know, like happens for a lot of immigrants from Latin America when they first come here, they speak two languages, okay, they're bilingual, but they speak school language and home language, home Spanish and school English. And so it's not fully functional. And so sometimes I try to study Spanish, and so one of the things I do to learn Spanish is I watch Spanish TV. And sometimes you get these things where these people are interviewed, and all of a sudden they realize they're being interviewed in the wrong language for what they're asking. They're asking about something that happened at home, and they're being asked questions in English, or the other way around. Okay? So it's not equivalent. So you're not going to have the same degree of cognitive flexibility. But eventually, they usually converge, and then they're fully functional. You know, it's an interesting thing. I met this one guy who was fluent. He's actually German in background, and he was fluent in English and in French. So we had some conversation, and we asked him. We were talking about some English word, and we wanted to know the French equivalent, or maybe it was the other way. It was a French word, and we wanted to know the English equivalent. And he says, I can't tell you that because I learned French from German, and I learned English from German. So the only way I can answer that is to first translate from French to German and then German to English. You know, it's not automatic. And of course, there may be something lost in the translation when you do that. Okay. But one of the problems, this is another reason why I didn't write the chapter for the second edition, is it's really hard to separate multilingualism or bilingualism from multiculturalism. Because most of the time they're heavily connected with each other. You know, each language has a culture associated with it. Whenever you learn a new language, that's one of the things you learn. It's not just how to say hello, but how to have different ways of interacting with each other. Learning that a lot of languages out there, like Spanish and Russian and so forth, you actually have to distinguish between whether or not you're friends with a person or not. You know, I mean, that's something that for English speakers, you know, we don't have to think about at all. You and I had this conversation about subjunctive. She knows Spanish really well. And, you know, the subjunctive in Spanish is very interesting because all of a sudden you have to think about the fact that sometimes you're talking about things that aren't actually real, but are things that are just part of your imagination or you have feelings about or are hypothetical. And all of a sudden you have to use different verb forms, you know? So that's actually part of your culture to have to do that.
A lot of English speakers don't know the subjunctive in English.
Yeah, right, that's true too.
They'll say if I was.
Yeah, instead of if I were. Or another one example is, I command that you be generous. That used to be like that, the subjunctive. Okay. Anyway, so multiculturalism is kind of tied, although you can have multiculturalism without multilingualism or bilingualism. It's more hard to separate it the other way. Okay. You know, like for example, a good example is the Netherlands, the Low Countries, before they split. You had one peoples who spoke a language that is mutually intelligible, but one was Roman Catholic and the other was Protestant. And so it's interesting, we ended up in English having different names for them. One we call Flemish, and the other we call Dutch. But they speak languages that are mutually intelligible. They're just dialects of each other. In fact, they're more mutually intelligible than Northern American and Southern American. I learned that when I taught at the University of Arkansas. Okay, so multiculturalism, there's some interesting research showing that it has a major impact. It increases with the duration. If you're exposed to different cultures, the longer you're exposed to two cultures, the more creative you tend to be. There's an interesting study that came out not too long ago studying people who are great designers. I'm not really into fashions. So to me, whenever they have a fashion show, you know, some people walk up and down this thing and they show off something. What does this mean? You know, it doesn't mean anything to me. I normally wear t-shirts and jeans, okay? I'm wearing jeans at least, but not a t-shirt. But it's a major form of creativity. Obviously, it's a very major form of creativity. And they actually measured the success of various designers. And one of the number one predictors is whether or not they have a multicultural background, living in a lot of different places. Okay? So, duration. But it also depends, and I think this is interesting, on experiential openness. There's actually a study that was done looking at people who lived abroad for a while in a different culture. You know, like study abroad in Rome or study abroad in Paris or wherever it happened to be. And not everybody benefits from it. You know? You have to score high on openness to experience. Right? I actually have experience with that with when I was in my first year in college, after I finished my first year in college, my girlfriend and I decided to ride our bicycles through Europe. And we did it in a group, you know, it was American Youth Hostels thing. And there were about 9 of us or so, 8, 9, I can't remember the exact number. And we came from all different areas of Southern California, different backgrounds or whatever. We varied tremendously in openness to experience, okay? And there was 2 people in our party who really bothered me, who all they could say all the time is, they do things so differently here. The food's so different. You know? And it was like, it was a problem. Because for the rest of it, it was like, this is why we're here. Because they do things so differently here. It's just so they were getting nothing out of it. You know, they go to Rome and go, God, I don't even understand your language.
Like people who stay at the Holiday Inn and eat at McDonald's.
Yeah, right. You know, what is the point of this? It's a lot cheaper just to, you know, watch TV at home. Anyway, so this is a very important moderator because there are people who don't benefit. And this is maybe hedging a little bit because, as you know, experiential openness is highly correlated with creativity anyway. So there's sort of a nomological network here we're talking about. And that's going to influence your probability of deciding to study abroad and how long you stay there and whether you decide to get a job there and so forth. Okay, now let me look briefly at the experimental research. First of all, there's a lot of really interesting stuff on group creativity, where your main independent variable is the composition of the group. And then, of course, you can manipulate a lot of different things, but one of the things that's interesting is to manipulate the diversity of the group. And then see if that affects the creative outcome. You're given some tasks to work on as a group and see whether or not both the time to solution and the quality of the solution is influenced by the group composition. And you find that membership diversity is a positive contributor, as long as the group is sufficiently cohesive and they have good communication amongst each other. You've got to establish those norms, right? And that's true for age, gender, ethnicity, the amount of training. Having both novices and world-famous experts in the same group, you know, is an advantage. You're going to get a different perspective. It's like professional marginality, you know, that we talked about earlier. Okay. So there's a lot of research on this. This diversity is highly correlated with creativity and group problem-solving situation. Okay. Individual creativity, it has even more research because it's easier to study individuals in a laboratory than to study groups in the laboratory. And I just want to mention a couple studies, one having to do with bicultural identity. This is a big topic now because we have a lot of biculturals. Like in California, we have bicultural, Spanish, Mexican American and Chinese American, Japanese American, Korean American. We have a lot of different bicultural people. And some have lots of identity with the two cultures, some have less. And some of them have lots of integration of the two, like being functionally equivalent in bilingualism, and some don't. And so that gets me on this notion of identity blendedness. If you're able to blend your identities and feel comfortable, both being an American and a Chinese, or a Mexican and an American, okay, then that makes you more creative. On the other hand, if you feel like they're in competition, there's this constant tension between the two. And so you can feel, I can only be an American or an Arab. I can't be an Arab American. Then you're not going to be as creative. Okay. And another one, this is one of the funnest experiments I've ever been involved in. It wasn't done at my lab, it was done at a lab in the Netherlands, where they have lots of cultural diversity and things like that. And it has to do with schema violation. Because remember, we're talking about diversified experiences, something that shakes you out of your normal way of thinking about things. All of a sudden you're just jarred, and all of a sudden the world looks different. You look at things differently. All of a sudden a pair of pliers can become a pendulum, okay? And so we did this interesting experiment, it had two parts to it. We used the brick task, you're familiar with the brick task, and we were particularly interested in the cognitive flexibility score on the brick task. And in the first experiment, this was fun. It was a violation of our expectations about the way the physical world works. We used a virtual reality situation. You're wearing these things. And in one manipulation, obviously the control group, what you see is normal. You walk around this imaginary room and nothing unusual happens. But in a second manipulation, the really interesting one, you walk around the room and crazy things happen. Like the closer you get to a table, the smaller it gets. It's like being Alice in Wonderland, You accidentally knock a bottle off the table, and it goes up. I mean, it was really, really bizarre stuff, okay? There was actually a third condition, what was interesting. People saw a film of the virtuality experience, but didn't have it themselves. So you see a room where bottles go up and tables shrink when you look like they're going, but you're not actually experiencing it. This embodied cognition idea. It's different than just abstract cognition. And the interesting thing is that group was no different from the people who just saw a normal world. So that vicarious experience doesn't help. But in the group that went into a world that was like, what was like actually being schizophrenic. Schizophrenics often report these images of like all of a sudden faces expanding and sounds coming out of nowhere and all this kind of stuff that are unexplained. And that's sort of what we're giving these people. We're giving them a schizophrenic experience where the whole world operated against the laws of nature, not just the laws of physics. Okay? And they became more creative, much more cognitively flexible than the ones in the other two groups. So we decided to do a variation, because remember, we're also interested in multiculturalism and that kind of thing. So can we manipulate multiculturalism in the laboratory? Okay? And remember, this is done in the Netherlands. And so we did an interesting cultural manipulation. Do we have any Dutch in here at all? Nobody. Okay. But anyway, evidently in the Netherlands, their favorite breakfast is to take a slice of bread and spread butter on it, and then sprinkle chocolate chips on top. You have that in Denmark? Oh, really? Okay. So anyway, I mean, that's cool, all right. So we had an experimental condition where they walked into a room, and that's what they had to do. They had to take a bread, put butter on it, and then put the chocolate chips on it. In the other condition, they were told, take the chocolate chips, put them at the bottom of the plate, put the butter on the bread, and then upside down. I mean, that seems like a trivial difference. But think of it, from their standpoint of view, they've been making breakfast the other way their entire lives practically, and all of a sudden they're asked to do it sort of like literally upside down and in a reverse order. Just that exposure increased their cognitive flexibility on the brick task. You know? So the first thing you should do when you go home, you know, I have Cheerios every morning. I should pour the milk in first and then pour in the Cheerios. Why not? Okay. By the way, I want to point out another study. I do have time to do this. I want to point out another study, and then we can have questions and all that. There's a study that came out recently. I was actually the reviewer for it. It came out in Psychological Science. And their interpretation, I think, was wrong. Okay? I think it fits actually into this. But it was an interesting study nonetheless. Their question was, what were the effects of order versus disorder on people? And they argued that disorder and order have both positive and negative effects, both of them, either way. Nothing like one's all good and one's all bad kind of thing. So, for example, and there's other research showing this, one of the things they looked at was, does order relative to disorder in your environment increase altruistic behavior? And they found that. But in the case of creativity, it's disorder that has the effect. That was their hypothesis. Okay. So what they did is they have students walk into a laboratory, and there's two different laboratories because it's random assignments. It's a real legitimate experiment, and then they crossed over the two labs. So half the time this lab, half the time that lab, but the two different manipulations and all that kind of stuff. Anyway. One group walks into this room, this laboratory cubicle, just like a lot of you have seen, and it's immaculate. You know, all the computers are all in the right place, all the folders are in the right place, the blinds on the windows in the back are all in order. In the other condition, they walk into it. The objects in the room are identical. Everything's identical. Same number of computers, same number of folders, you know, the blinds, everything's the same. Same number of chairs. But it's all in total disarray. Like someone went in there and vandalized it. You know, folders are on the floor, and the blinds are like helter-skelter. I'm just a mess. And then they were given the exact same task, exact same creativity task, and those people were more creative. Okay?
So
Now,
my messy house, how much?
that's your choice. Someone has to do it for you.
Chaos.
But anyway, the point is that they had this one interpretation. But to me, this is a violation of schema, because when you walk into a lab, you expect it to be a lab, where everything is held its place and everything's neatly. You don't expect the folders to be on the floor and stuff like that. So I think this is just like making your breakfast upside down, and that's why it increased their creativity. Okay. Anyway, conclusion. All right, very simple conclusion. Taking all together all of this various evidence, very, very diverse in methodology and so forth, the correlation experimental research supports the proposition that diversifying experiences, however defined, because of a huge inventory of them, does in fact increase creativity. The impact does appear to be stronger in the arts and the sciences, for those where they've done that actual test. I gave you some examples, like the homes of artists are more unstable than the homes of scientists. Differences in psychopathology, okay, in the arts and the sciences. And it's much more conspicuous in big C than little c creativity. Very strong things, parental death and what have you. That's why I tell my students, well, my parents did die. Does that mean I'm doomed? And I said, no, it doesn't mean you're doomed. Most of us we find to just be little c creators. And you can kind of slowly move up the font size using other Okay, and I'm going to give you an illustration. And by the way, this was kind of sad because I have an article coming out in JPSP where we did a study of 291 eminent African Americans to test this notion that there's a trade-off between what we call developmental adversity, and that's one reason why I picked the African Americans, because they have lots of examples, and psychopathology. Because the interesting thing is, for creative geniuses amongst African Americans, psychopathology levels are much lower than they are in majority culture. And people say, well, maybe that's just reporting bias. Oh, no, it's not reporting bias. For example, there's tons of poets who have committed suicide in majority culture. Not one single African American poet committed suicide. I mean, it's just, there's no overlap in the distributions. Okay? So I'm going to give you an example of one who we got the proofs, and then she died that day. And we didn't know what to do because, we're going to add something to it or whatever. But then people think, well, maybe that's ingratiating, or maybe we added the whole example, because it's the final paragraph of the entire paper. Maybe we added it in proofs or something. So we just left it untouched. Okay, but it was just interesting. And I actually had to change this presentation because obviously things that were once future tense became past tense, Okay, so Maya Angelou, who fortunately you heard a lot about recently, okay? So you probably, this is all review for you, okay? But she had an amazing life. I mean, the epitome of diversifying experiences. Okay, but without the psychopathology, because she had the development of diversity in spades. Okay, so she's born in St. Louis, which is going to have a lot happening soon. I'm obviously from the San Francisco area, so. Anyway. Oh no, it's Kansas City. Sorry about that. Other side of the state. Father was a doorman and a Navy dietitian. The mother was a nurse and a car dealer. Interesting combinations. Remember I talked about parental diversity? That's parental diversity, okay? At age 3, the parents had a horrible marriage, so it's a very unpredictable family background, by far, okay? And it ended, the father shipped her off and with her older brother, out of the blue, with no expectation whatsoever, no warning, to a train to Stamps, Arkansas, and I taught not too far from there, and to live with her paternal grandmother. And there she experienced the first time the real brutality of racial discrimination, which we included among the examples, obviously developmental adversity, really, really deep South type racial discrimination. At age 7, the father arrives unannounced. It's like he read all this stuff that I did centuries later and decided to apply it, and returns them to their mother in St. Louis. Okay. At age 8, just 1 year later, she's sexually abused and raped by her mother's boyfriend. Whoa, that's heavy. She told her older brother, and eventually the boyfriend was killed. What she inferred and a lot of other people inferred was she told older brother, he told his friends, and they decided to take care of business. Okay. And this was traumatic because even though they killed her rapist, it was her mother's boyfriend after all, and she ended up being mute for almost 5 years. She just had problems talking. Very emotional. And so the father sends her back to the grandmother. So she's being shuttled back and forth. Crazy. Age 14, she moved back with her mother, who's now in Oakland, California. And at age 16, she dropped out of school to work as the first African-American female streetcar conductor in San Francisco. Kind of interesting. I actually, part of one earlier African-American study I did, I looked at African-American firsts to see if one of the ways you become famous is to be the first to break the ceiling, the first with a PhD, the first with the MD, that kind of thing. And it is a major predictor. And there's actually some really good books on African-American firsts. And by the way, part of how I got into that is the work I've done on leaders, where I find the first leader in a group, like the first king in a dynasty, is often the greatest. Who is often considered the greatest president of the United States? George Washington. Okay? Not always. A lot of times people put Lincoln. I have a T-shirt with George Washington on it, and he's got one of those big fingers you have in sports games saying, "I'm number one." Okay, so she was the first. Okay. She had a child out of wedlock. Right? It's not good. As far as diversifying experience, it's great, but it puts more strain on her. Her mother's life declined in poverty and crime. Let's call a spade a spade. She became a prostitute. This is not cool. It's kind of interesting because her mom was going down as Angela was going up. The trajectories ended up reversing. And later, she kind of celebrated memoirist, poet, novelist, educator, dramatist, producer, actress, historian, filmmaker, and civil rights activist. I think she was pretty creative. Okay? And famous enough that some of you may remember, she was read a poem at the inauguration of Clinton. Okay?
Papers said here about that?
Huh?
You know what the papers in the South said about that?
Oh, no.
About that poem? How stupid it was of Clinton, or how inaccurate or inappropriate to choose something as poorly written.
Oh, really?
as
Okay.
well.
Well, that's their opinion. But, this is, to me, an amazing thing because, except for that time when she went mute, she was one of the most mentally healthy people you could possibly imagine. So all of her creativity came out of her adversity rather than any kind of psychopathology. All right, that's it. I'm ready for questions.